My son-in-law stood at the front of the funeral home with a glass of water in his hand and a smile on his face, telling everyone within earshot that I would receive nothing from my wife's estate. He said it quietly, the way people say things they want overheard. And he was so certain, so completely, utterly certain. Then the solicitor cleared his throat, unfolded a second document I had never seen before, and began to read. My son-in-law set down his water glass very carefully, and that smile disappeared like smoke in a February wind. I should back up. My name is Hugh, and I am 64 years old. I worked 31 years as an electrician for the city of Halifax, Nova Scotia, running conduit through hospital basements and school gymnasiums, and the kind of government buildings that smell like floor wax and recycled air. I retired 3 years ago with a modest pension, a bad left knee, and the particular satisfaction of a man who did honest work and never once pretended otherwise. I am not a complicated person. I never owned a business. I never sat on a board. I never had a portfolio beyond a modest RRSP that I checked approximately twice per decade. My wife Sandra was a different story entirely. I met her in 1986 at a continuing education class in downtown Halifax. She was taking bookkeeping. I was there by accident, having misread the course catalog, and arrived expecting a class on residential wiring. The instructor had not yet appeared. Sandra was already seated in the front row, reading an article about small business tax law, her pen moving in small, decisive circles whenever she disagreed with something. I sat 2 rows behind her and watched a woman argue silently with a magazine, and I thought, that is someone worth knowing. It took me 3 weeks to say more than hello. She was direct in the way that some people mistake for coldness, but once you understood it was simply that she did not waste words, you began to treasure every one she gave you. We had dinner at a Greek restaurant on Barrington Street. We talked for 4 hours about everything except bookkeeping. She told me about growing up in Truro, about her father who ran a hardware store and kept a paper ledger until the day he retired. I told her about my own father, a plumber who smelled perpetually of pipe dope, and taught me that the only real job security was competence. We married in 1989. Our daughter Renata arrived in 1991. For the first decade, we lived the ordinary life of 2 people building something together. I pulled overtime. Sandra started her bookkeeping practice out of a spare bedroom. 2 clients, then 12, then 40. By the time Renata started high school, Sandra had moved into an office on Quinpool Road and had 6 employees. By the time Renata graduated university, Sandra's firm managed accounts for commercial properties across Atlantic Canada. She had a reputation I could not fully explain but could clearly see. People trusted her with their most consequential numbers, and she never once betrayed that trust. I was proud of her. I want to say that clearly because what came later could be mistaken for resentment, and I genuinely had none. I was an electrician who fixed things. She was a woman who built things. We were not in competition. We were, for a long time, simply married. The distance arrived slowly, the way most real damage does. It began when Renata brought home the man she would eventually marry, a financial advisor from Toronto named Trent, who wore his confidence like an expensive coat and seemed to regard me as a curiosity, the way people regard an antique tool whose specific purpose they cannot identify. He was not cruel exactly. He was simply a person who organized the world by usefulness, and I did not rank highly in his categories. Sandra liked him. That was the honest truth of it, and it surprised me, because Sandra had never been easily impressed. But Trent spoke her language. He understood yield and equity and leverage. He had opinions about the commercial real estate market that Sandra found interesting. He laughed at her jokes about fiscal quarters in a way that suggested he actually understood them. When Renata and Trent married in 2015, I noticed for the first time that Sandra and I had begun to exist in adjacent lives rather than a shared one. She came home later. The conversations we had were efficient, logistical, brief. I would ask about her day and she would say fine and mean it. But fine meant something small now. A closing sentence rather than a beginning. I said something about it once, in the kitchen on a Sunday morning in 2017. I said I felt like I was living with a colleague. Sandra looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her face that I recognized but could not name. A kind of tired honesty, like a woman who has been carrying something too long and has stopped pretending the weight is nothing. She said, "You're probably right." I thought that was the beginning of a conversation. It turned out to be the end of one. We separated in 2018. The legal process was civil because Sandra was incapable of being anything else and because neither of us had the appetite for warfare. I received a fair settlement. The house in Bedford went to Sandra. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Dartmouth, overlooking the harbour. I told myself it was temporary. Eventually, I stopped calling it that. Renata called me the week after I moved in. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. She said she hoped I was okay. She said Trent thought it might be best if things settled down before we all spend time together. I said I understood. I did not, entirely, but I said it. The years between 2018 and last November are not complicated to describe. I worked my remaining years until retirement. I fished on weekends with my neighbor Vince. I cooked badly and improved slowly. I exchanged Christmas cards with Sandra that were warm in the way that carefully chosen words can be warm, present, but protected. I knew she had continued to grow the firm. I knew she had sold a significant portion of it to a national property management group out of Calgary sometime around 2021, though I learned the details secondhand through mutual acquaintances. I knew she had been diagnosed with something, a cardiac condition, in the spring of 2 years ago, because she had sent me a brief email that said only, "I wanted you to hear it from me first. I am handling it." I replied that I was sorry and that I was there if she needed anything. She replied, "I know. Thank you, Hugh." That was the last direct communication I had with her before the call from her solicitor. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early November. I was in the middle of replacing a faulty outlet in my bathroom, old habits, when my phone rang. The woman on the line introduced herself as Petra, a solicitor from a firm in downtown Halifax. She told me that Sandra had passed away on the previous Saturday. She told me the memorial service was scheduled for that Thursday at a funeral home in the South End, and she told me that Sandra had named me as a beneficiary in her will, and that my presence at the reading on Friday afternoon was required. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub and held the phone against my leg for a long time. Beneficiary. The word felt wrong in the context of Sandra and me. We had been separated for 6 years. She had built an empire, genuinely, that is not an exaggeration. In the years since we parted, whatever she had left behind would go to Renata, to the business partners, to whatever charitable interests she had developed. There was no version of events in which I featured meaningfully, unless she had simply decided to forgive an old debt. Perhaps something minor, a small sum to close an old account. I told myself that was almost certainly it. Thursday arrived gray and cold, the way November in Nova Scotia earns its reputation. The funeral home was in the south end of Halifax, a tall Victorian building that Sandra would have chosen specifically because it did not announce itself. Inside, 200 people moved through the space in the quiet, productive grief of people who admired the deceased. I recognized almost none of them. I found a seat near the back. I had worn my good navy suit, the one I owned for court dates and funerals, and I felt underdressed anyway, surrounded by the kind of people whose clothing requires no visible effort because the effort has been made invisible by money. He found me before I found him. Trent appeared at my shoulder with the smooth precision of someone who had been watching for my arrival. He was 51, tall. The kind of handsome that photographs well and diminishes slightly in person. He was wearing a dark suit that fit exactly the way suits are supposed to fit in magazine advertisements. "Dad," he said, using the word the way people use a tool they haven't bothered to maintain. I turned to face him. I hadn't expected the word to land the way it did. Not warmly. I want to be clear about that. but with a kind of hollow resonance, like a door knocked on an empty house. "I'm glad you came," he said, and his voice carried just enough volume that the three people nearest to us could hear him clearly. "Although I have to say, I'm not entirely sure Sandra would have expected it." "She named me as a beneficiary," I said. "The solicitor called." He smiled. There was nothing unkind in the smile, which somehow made it worse. He was doing me the professional courtesy of not displaying what he felt. "Yes," he said. "There's a small provision. Something from the early years of the estate. I wouldn't get too hopeful, Hugh. She built most of what she had after 2018. You understand how that works." I said I understood. He moved closer, lowering his voice just enough that only I could hear. "I want to ask you to keep a low profile today. For Renata's sake. This is hard enough without complications." I looked at him. I thought about the 6-minute phone call in 2018. I thought about the Christmas cards. I thought about Sandra's email in my inbox. "I wanted you to hear it from me first." "I'll sit here," I said. "I won't bother anyone." He nodded, satisfied, and returned to the front of the room, where Renata stood receiving condolences with the focused composure of a woman who had learned professionalism from the most professionally composed person I had ever known. The service was long and beautiful and entirely accurate. The people who spoke about Sandra described her with the specific detail that only comes from genuine experience. A woman who sent handwritten notes when people retired, who showed up reliably to things she said she would attend, who remembered the names of people's children and their children's pets, who had once apparently stayed at the office until 2 in the morning to fix an accounting error she had inherited from a predecessor, not because it was her responsibility, but because she believed accuracy was a form of respect. I cried twice. I was not embarrassed by it. When the service ended, Trent materialized at my side again with a glass of water I had not asked for, and a voice pitched carefully for the small cluster of people nearby. "Obviously, the bulk of the estate will reflect Sandra's years of building the business," he said pleasantly. He was speaking to me but performing for the room. "I'm sure whatever token she set aside for you is a nice gesture. She was always thoughtful that way." The woman beside him, a business associate of Sandra's, I thought, gave me a brief, sympathy-shaped look. The kind people give when they want to convey, "This must be embarrassing for you." I took the water glass. I said nothing. I had been a tradesman for 30 years. I knew the difference between a man who was confident and a man who needed you to witness his confidence. Trent was the second kind. The solicitor's office was on Hollis Street, on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled of old wood and current money. Petra was perhaps 45, with the kind of composed efficiency that suggested she had delivered news both good and terrible and treated both with equal professional steadiness. She gestured us toward chairs across a wide oak desk. Trent sat. Renata sat beside him. I took the chair slightly to the side, the one that felt like the chair for the person who might not need to hear everything. Renata had not spoken to me directly since the funeral home. She had looked at me twice across the room, and both times something had moved across her face that I could not name. Not coldness exactly, but something careful and contained, like a feeling she had agreed to keep behind glass. Petra opened the folder in front of her and removed a document bound in the traditional blue backing of estate paperwork. She began to read. Sandra had left a generous donation to the IWK Health Center in Halifax, a place that had treated the children of people she cared about. She had left a scholarship in her father's name at the Nova Scotia Community College. She had left the condominium on South Park Street to Renata outright, along with a sum of $800,000 from her primary investment accounts. She had left equal bequests to 2 longtime employees of the firm. Trent's hand rested on his knee with the casual readiness of a man waiting to be handed something he has already planned to receive. Petra turned a page. "There is an additional provision," she said. Trent sat forward slightly. Petra looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. "To my former husband, Hugh." She read this carefully, as though each word had been chosen by someone who knew the weight of words. I leave the following. The room was very quiet. The sum of $2,400,000 to be transferred from my secondary investment portfolio within 90 days of probate. I heard Renata draw a sharp breath. Trent's hand, which had been resting so casually on his knee, went still. Additionally, Petra continued, I transfer to Hugh full ownership of the Quinpool Road property, currently valued at approximately $900,000, and the commercial lease income associated with that property, estimated at $68,000 annually. The numbers were large enough that they had stopped sounding like numbers. They had become something else, something I could not organize into sense while sitting in that chair in that room with those people. Trent's voice, when it came, was low and controlled and entirely without the pleasant ease it had carried all morning. That cannot be right. Petra looked at him without expression. She was not in contact with him, Trent said. He gestured at me with the precision of someone who has practiced dismissing people. He's been out of her life for 6 years. She wouldn't. She couldn't have been thinking clearly when Your mother-in-law underwent a full capacity assessment in September of last year, Petra said. These documents were prepared and executed with full legal deliberation. They represent her clearly stated and legally binding wishes. This is absurd. His voice had acquired an edge. We will contest this. Mental incapacity, undue influence, there are. Trent. Renata said his name once quietly. He stopped. She was looking at the documents on Petra's desk. Her face had done something I had not expected. It had softened. Petra reached for a second envelope, cream-colored, with handwriting across the front I recognized immediately, even after 6 years. Sandra's handwriting. Small, precise, the letters leaning slightly forward as though in a hurry toward the next thought. She left a personal message, Petra said. To be read following the disclosure of provisions. She asked me to read it aloud to both of you. Both of us. I looked at Renata. She was looking at her hands. Petra opened the envelope. Hugh, she read. If Petra is reading this, then I am gone, and you are probably sitting in that chair wondering whether someone has made a clerical error. I know you. You are going to spend the next 10 minutes trying to find the polite way to say there has been some mistake. There has not been a mistake. I pressed my hands together in my lap. My eyes were doing something I was not entirely prepared for. I spent a lot of years after 28 and being angry at you for not being more like the world I had built. I was wrong about that, and I knew it by about 2020, and I was too proud to say so directly. That is my failure. Not yours. You were always exactly who you said you were. I was the one who kept expecting the currency to change. Trent had gone completely still. Renata had not moved at all. The Quinpool Road property was where I started. Petra continued reading. The second floor was your design. You ran the wiring yourself one weekend in 1993 when we could not afford to hire anyone. I never told anyone that. I should have. That building is the first thing I ever owned that felt fully mine, and you are the reason it stands the way it does. My throat was doing something that made it difficult to remain composed. I gave up trying. The money is not a consolation prize, and it is not guilt, Sandra's letter said. It is recognition. You kept a home. You showed up to things. You made ordinary life feel like it was worth protecting, and I did not understand what that cost you until I had spent several years without it. I am sorry it took me so long to say so. I hope you do something quiet and good with it because that is who you are. You always were. Renata made a sound beside me, small and sudden, like something she had been holding back, releasing without her permission. I looked at her. She was crying in the particular way of someone who has been trying not to. There was more in the letter, practical matters, instructions about the property management, a note to Renata that Petra read in a lower voice that I did not try to absorb. When Petra finished, she folded the pages with deliberate care and returned them to the envelope. She offered it to me across the desk. I held it with both hands for a moment, the way you hold something fragile. Trent stood abruptly, his chair pushing back against the hardwood floor. He moved toward the door, stopped, and turned. His composure had returned, but it was a different kind now, assembled rather than natural. "This will be challenged," he said. "You should understand that clearly." I looked at him. I thought about the water glass at the funeral home, the careful volume of his voice when he spoke near other people, the word Dad used like a piece of equipment. "I understand," I said. He left. The door closed with the particular finality of a door closed by a man who wants the closing to mean something. Renata and I sat in the quiet office for a moment. Petra was arranging papers, giving us what privacy she could. "I didn't know," Renata said finally. Her voice was very small. "I know," I said. She was looking at her hands again. "She kept her distance from you after the separation. That was," she paused, "that was partly Trent, and partly me. And I've known for a while that it wasn't right, and I didn't do anything about it, and I'm sorry, Dad." The word landed entirely differently from the way it had sounded in Trent's mouth. It opened something rather than closing it. I reached over and put my hand briefly over hers. "That's enough," I said. "We don't have to do this here." She nodded. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, a gesture I recognized from when she was 11 years old and had fallen off a bicycle and was trying to decide whether to cry or not. Petra completed the paperwork with the calm efficiency of someone who has witnessed enough of human nature to be moved, but not derailed by it. She handed me copies of the relevant documents. She told me the timeline for transfer. She shook my hand at the door and said with what seemed like genuine warmth that Sandra had spoken about me with considerable affection in their last several meetings. I didn't know what to say to that. I said thank you. I walked out onto Hollis Street into a cold November afternoon, the harbour visible at the end of the block, the city making its ordinary sounds around me. I stood on the pavement for a while, not thinking exactly, just standing in the fact of it. Sandra had loved me, not past tense, not in the archaeological sense of something buried, loved me right up until the end, in the quiet, honest way that sometimes only becomes visible in retrospect. Like the wiring inside a wall, invisible until the lights come on, and then unmistakably the reason they do. I did not feel victorious. I want to be clear about that, because there is a kind of story in which a man receives unexpected validation and walks away feeling triumphant over the people who underestimated him. That was not what I felt. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name. A sense that the ledger of a life does not always balance in the ways you expect, and that the people who love you sometimes keep accounts you never knew existed. I had a lot of work ahead of me. I knew nothing about commercial property. I would need to find people who did. I would need to learn things at 64 that most people learn at 40, and I would make mistakes, and some of them would be costly, and I would fix them the way I had always fixed things, methodically, without drama, one correct connection at a time. But first I went home. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table overlooking the harbour, holding Sandra's letter in both hands, and I read it again from the beginning, slowly, the way you read something you want to keep. I keep coming back to the moment Trent set down that water glass. It was such a small thing. He had been holding it with the ease of a man who is comfortable taking up space, and then Petra read Sandra's words and his hand just placed it down. Carefully, the way you set something down when you suddenly need both hands free to deal with something you did not expect. I have thought about that gesture more than I have thought about the money. What I understand now, sitting at this kitchen table with Sandra's letter folded in front of me, is that nothing in that solicitor's office happened by accident. Not the inheritance, not Trent's certainty, not even the 6 years of silence that preceded it. Everything followed from choices that were made long before any of us sat down in those leather chairs. Sandra chose to pay attention to what actually mattered, quietly, over decades, while everyone around her assumed they already knew what she valued. Trent chose to measure people by the wrong currency for so long that he genuinely could not imagine a different ledger existed. And I chose, mostly without thinking about it, to keep showing up as the same person regardless of whether it appeared to be working. That last one is the only part I had any real control over, and I did not always do it gracefully. There were years when I felt invisible, years when I wondered whether Sandra's world had simply outgrown me, and whether I had been foolish to stay as long as I did. Equanimity is not the same as contentment, and I will not pretend I was content. But I did not become someone else to compensate. I did not perform a version of success I did not feel. I went to work, I came home, I fixed things that needed fixing, and I tried to treat people. Renata, my colleagues, my neighbors, the strangers at the hardware store, with the same basic decency regardless of what they could do for me. That sounds simple. It is not. The pressure to revise yourself according to other people's expectations is constant and subtle, and it wears on you in ways you don't fully notice until you look back. Trent never revised himself either, but the direction he held was inward, toward advantage, toward position, toward the version of events that placed him at the center. The difference between us was not intelligence. He was, in many respects, sharper than me. The difference was what we were each willing to do with that intelligence. Whether we used it to understand the world more honestly or to manage how the world perceived us. Sandra understood that distinction. She had spent years living on the wrong side of it, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize it before the end. That took something, not cleverness, but the harder thing. The willingness to look at your own accounting and admit where the numbers don't hold. Renata called me 2 days after the reading. We talked for 40 minutes. It was the longest conversation we'd had in years, and most of it was ordinary. Her job, my knee, the weather in Halifax in November. But at the end she said, "I'd like to come for Christmas, Dad, if that's okay." I said it was more than okay. Some things take a long time to come around. But they do come around if the people involved have the patience to wait and the honesty to recognize the moment when it arrives. I am 64 years old. I have a property I do not know how to manage, a letter I will keep until I cannot, and a daughter who is finding her way back. That feels like enough to build from.